Hello everybody, it's Merlin here. I told you to get those requests out of the way, and so this is one that came to me fairly recently. It was to do a top 5 or a top 10 of my favorite Dragon Ball Z villains. Now I decided to go for a little more quantity and might as well do a top 10 because there's a lot of villains. So, let's get to it. Now, I'm going to go with just one honorable mention. I'm going to stick to the anime primarily, just of the Dragon Ball Z section. So no early Dragon Ball villains, because that's what the request specifically asked for. And I'm going to stick to stuff that's canon, so no filler. But I do want to give an honorable mention to Garlic Jr. I think there are people out there that like him, but he doesn't get quite as much respect as he deserves. I mean, he was something different. He was a small, calculating villain with a very interesting backstory who was fairly intimidating and, you know, had a fairly good success rate, actually gaining immortality, gaining the Dragon Balls, and he could be a fairly intimidating force. He added a real horror element to his little arc, and I don't know, I thought he was a good kind of refreshing pace for the series, actually. So, just an honorable mention, but he doesn't make it officially into my top 10. To start this off, my number 10 is actually Android 19. Now, I know what you're thinking, really? Well, Android 19 admittedly does not have much personality. He's basically just a henchman. He's probably one of the most henchman-y of the henchmen in the series, to be completely honest. But he was very intimidating. He had a very unique look, and let's be honest, he did come technically the closest to actually just killing Goku. Now, Goku, of course, had the heart disease, and he wasn't in his strongest state, but just seeing him clutching Goku's neck as he turns back and just stares at the Z Fighters, and just kind of has that smile, like, you know, it was really creepy and disturbing. And you just see that look of pure pain in Goku's face. It's just like he's crushing his neck. He's very intimidating. Plus, I like the energy absorption, and I like his design. I thought he was a decent bad guy, actually, and he got to, you know, get destroyed by Vegeta, so that's a good way to go out, like many villains do. Speaking of which, my number 9 is Nappa. Now, Nappa, once again, when you really get down to it, he's basically just a henchman, but I think Nappa almost symbolically represents a change of pace for the Z Fighters, because for the world's mightiest heroes, you know, this is not the Avengers, this is the Z Fighters, but same basic concept here. In the early years of Dragon Ball, you know, in the early arcs, we saw that everybody was basically on an even playing field. Even though Goku was significantly stronger, everybody had something to contribute. They had some technique or some ability, something they could do to kind of contribute to the battle and the quest. Something which, as we've discussed many times, in later years that became less prevalent in the series, and it's one of the flaws of the series, you could argue. But Nappa sort of represents the changing of that age, because you had all the people who had something significant to do in the earlier arcs face up against the guy who's technically the number 2 guy. I mean, Vegeta is the main villain of this arc, and Nappa, we learn, is so much more powerful than any of the other fighters and starts wiping them out one by one. His fight with Tien was devastating. He, of course, kills Piccolo, nearly kills Krillin and Gohan with almost no effort at all. They're doing everything they can, all their strategy, all their techniques, all their powers, and it has almost no effect on Nappa. And we learned that Vegeta is so much more powerful for this guy. After everything they've been through, they're getting destroyed by this big brute, and it's how the world's going to end. It's a pretty dark change of pace. So it was really quite terrifying with Nappa, even though he was basically just a henchman as well. Number 8 is another android. That would be Android 17. Now, to be honest, I always kind of felt like Android 17 was barely a villain. Much like 18 and 16, he admittedly wanted to kill Goku, and I guess technically that is bad, but it's not like he really went out to destroy the world or wreak havoc. He just kind of had to overcome his programming. And I thought he was interesting, though. I like the fact that basically all the androids have, trying to struggle with their programming versus their humanity and trying to retain what little personality they had before. Android 17 was interesting, but I feel that he was at his best in 2 particular moments. At the beginning, when he is reawakened by Dr. Gero, he turns on his master and just straight up murders him, much like he did in Trunks' timeline. So we still think right now that these androids might be about as evil as they come, might be the threat that they were purported to be. So we really don't know based upon what we see. It's just so evil, so disturbing, so cold. You know, this is a machine out to destroy everything. That was just really significant right there. Crushing Dr. Gero's head, definitely something. Also, he has, honestly, what I think the best fight in all of Dragon Ball, or at least one of them, I'd say in the Z section. The fight between Android 17 and Piccolo is just so amazing, mostly because it is the last fight to really incorporate some kind of martial arts, and because the fighters were so evenly matched, it made it all the more intense. You didn't know who was going to win. Now, some people might say Piccolo could have taken Android 17 out with one big blast, maybe, but I think that because 17 never runs out of energy, Piccolo would eventually have been worn down. Number 7 is Zarbon. And I kind of want to almost say Zarbon and Dodoria because I kind of feel like you need them both as Frieza's right-hand men. Zarbon is just kind of interesting because he's a more charismatic villain, and he was one of the first ones we got to see transform, and actually the first person on planet Namek to really give Vegeta a difficult time. Up until that point, Vegeta had been wiping out the other henchmen pretty easily. And Zarbon kind of represents sort of another aspect that we see regarding Frieza. Frieza liked to select the most powerful and usually the noble members of some hierarchy in the race of the planets that he conquered and take them as his servants and his students, I guess you could say, make them his best soldiers. And Zarbon is supposedly very similar to Vegeta, also kind of highborn. And I just think he's kind of a cool design villain. I like that sense of sophistication and royalty, even though he is subservient to Frieza. He also really knows what's going on. He's very loyal to Frieza, but he's also extremely scared of him as well. And he detests Vegeta just like everybody else. Now, number 6, I guess you could say, could go to Captain Ginyu. Because Captain Ginyu is kind of unique among Dragon Ball villains because he has a sense of honor. I mean, he really didn't like accepting help from Jace when he was fighting Goku. He could tell Goku had the ability to hide his ki and wanted to power him up at his full extension. Also because he was loyal to Frieza, we suppose. But also, the fact that he probably does the most disturbing thing, he just punches himself through the chest, okay? He punches himself in the heart and does a body switch with Goku. That is probably the most ridiculously awesome thing I've seen. I mean, he's so devoted, and he's so hardcore. I don't know if it gets more hardcore than Captain Ginyu. But as a side, I kind of wanted to give this section to the whole Ginyu Force, just because when the Ginyu Force arrived, you knew what was happening. The Ginyu Force were just one of the greatest teams in anime, let's be honest. They're the Sentai, man. It's amazing. Number 5 is Raditz. Now, Raditz, more than any other villain in the series, I think got a really bad deal. Because he was Goku's evil brother. He was Goku's brother, and yet he was so underutilized. And his fight, his early moments in the series, really brought that huge transition into the Z era of this whole new era of far more power, far more ridiculous battles, etc. More science fiction and fantasy based, had the plot twist regarding everything, and was kind of a foreshadowing to the Saiyans and Frieza and everything else, this much bigger world. And yet he was there so brief. Very important villain, very underutilized though, and very evil. Very great introduction to the Saiyan race because he showed that he didn't care. He would use his nephew as leverage. He wasn't sure if his brother was alive, found out about him, didn't care. Was going to use him just on another mission, said you're going to wipe out this planet just to prove your loyalty. I mean, what an evil villain, but what a charismatically evil villain. You know, Raditz, poorly underused, but a really great and really underrated Dragon Ball Z villain. Number 4 is Dr. Gero. I've talked about Dr. Gero a little bit in the past, kind of similar to Raditz, but maybe even more so, because Dr. Gero, because he wasn't the most physical villain, he wasn't the big boss, wasn't involved in too many major fights, people might not think of him as being one of the great villains, but Dr. Gero really is. I mean, he was responsible for creating the androids, for creating Cell, and his hatred towards Goku was just built on years and years after what happened to the Red Ribbon Army. So he was deeply connected to something that happened years and years earlier in the early seasons of Dragon Ball. It was really great to have that callback to an older time, an older villain, a more retro sci-fi mad scientist guy. And it's just interesting to see this brilliant man just turn to evil and then go completely insane and ultimately be destroyed by his own creations. But at the same time, his hatred was so powerful and his genius was so incredible, he was able to create this computer to basically create Cell over years and years. And Cell is not only a combination of all the heroes and villains, but he's really kind of the personification of Dr. Gero's Dark Dream, which I believe they do mention in one of the dubs of the series. But that's kind of what I think of. In a way, Dr. Gero is really the kind of the main villain of the arc, in much the similar way that you could say Darth Vader's the main villain of Star Wars. In a way, the Emperor is kind of the ultimate villain, even though he's behind the scenes much of the time. Top 3. Well, the number 3 is Vegeta. Now, Vegeta honestly could probably take number 1 or 2 spots, but he's definitely high up there. I almost didn't even consider putting him on the list for obvious reasons. I mean, Vegeta has some great character development in the terms that he, over years and years, he slowly becomes one of the heroes of the series. And I think more people identify him as a hero because for the majority of Z, he was a hero. Or at least, you know, an anti-hero on the good guy's side. But the thing is, when Vegeta was introduced as the first major villain when the Saiyans arrived, he was just such an evil villain. He was so vile, so despicable, but so charismatic as well, and so intimidating. And his fight with Goku is one of the best animated and most intense. And he's arguably also quite possibly the toughest villain, because after everything, after everybody teaming up on him and trying to beat him down, Vegeta would not give up. And Vegeta couldn't regenerate. Vegeta wasn't ridiculously powerful. He couldn't breathe in space like certain other villains. He didn't have all the lack of limitations, you could say. But he was just incredibly tough and resilient. And of course, his pride always got in his way, and it was always interesting to see his reactions whenever something didn't go his way. And he was still villainous throughout much of the series and was so integral to the arcs, obviously. Just as a character, in general, he's far more important than any of the other DBZ villains. You could technically argue Piccolo, but he was only really still a villain for maybe like the first episode. So that doesn't really count. But the most important thing is Vegeta ultimately still was fighting against those dark aspects of himself, because in the Majin Buu arc, when Babidi uses the magic to bring back the darkness, we still see that Vegeta hadn't quite gotten over it, and he still saw that Vegeta was, in fact, a very, very evil person. Maybe Frieza made it worse, maybe his Saiyan lineage made it worse, but Vegeta murdered many people, he was incredibly selfish, and he was so driven by his desire to prove that he was the best, and his hatred towards Goku and Gohan was so strong, he just wanted to take him down. And Majin Vegeta was a great callback, and I would argue one of the most frightening aspects, and one of the best written in the series. Even though a certain villain and some other villains from that period might be missing, Majin Vegeta still is, that whole section is still the best part to come out of the Buu arc. Absolutely. And I argue maybe where it should have ended. Number 2 is Frieza. Now, Frieza, once again, fantastic villain, so intimidating in comparison to a lot of the other ones, because in his arc, his power gap was so much bigger and so much wider in comparison to any of the other villains. Even Piccolo and Vegeta really could barely do anything against Frieza. Frieza was just so powerful, and he was so giddy about it. He just knew how powerful he was, and he knew how superior he felt he was towards everyone. Because of his power, he felt so inclined, basically, to dominate others, to suppress others. He basically just sold entire planets and wiped them out for the highest bidder, just to run a business on the side, because he wanted to. Really, that's what it is. He's so powerful and has so much of that pride, and he thinks he's so basically high above and superior to every other race, he can do whatever he wants. That's what's so frightening about Frieza, is that he is a representation of the ultimate evil. That's what Akira Toriyama said, and I think that's one reason why Frieza is considered to be one of the greatest villains. He also has a great design, and he is also the antithesis of Goku, where Goku is fairly compassionate and does fight for others most of the time. Frieza, of course, lives to dominate others, and their fight is, of course, legendary. And it's just kind of hard to beat, honestly. Frieza is an excellent villain, and you could argue that in terms of his relation, he is sort of an anti-arch-villain to Piccolo for wiping out the Namekians, and Gohan because he thought that who destroyed Goku, and of course his friend Dende, and of course Vegeta after suppressing him and destroying the Saiyans. Frieza is an excellent villain, and it's very easy to see why he's so highly ranked in anime greatest villains lists, you know, for years and years to come. But that leaves us to our number 1. Number 1 would be Cell. Now, if you guys know me, I've mentioned that Cell is my favorite villain in Dragon Ball Z. One of my favorite villains in all of Dragon Ball. And though I don't know if he is technically better than Frieza, I've always noticed that in polls, usually Cell and Frieza are always the closest. Some polls Cell is number one, some it's Frieza, but it's always very tight. I think Frieza generally is considered the most popular, but Cell is either right there below him or sometimes ahead of him. So they're very close. And that's because Cell is, you could argue, like Frieza, and maybe even Boo after him, in a way was meant to be, of course, the final ending to the series, and he was designed to be the ultimate villain. And a very comic book standard, he had the powers, abilities, and memories, and personality traits of all the heroes and villains, the strongest ones in the galaxy up to that point. So he was kind of a reflection of the past, and also the darker natures of the heroes. So not only did he have their abilities, he also kind of was inside their heads and knew something about them that gave him an advantage. And I think philosophically, Cell is honestly one of the most complex, because even though he was sort of programmed like the other androids, he was biomechanical. I think he knew the difference between good and evil. He embraced the darker sides. And granted, you could argue nature versus nurture. He was programmed to have Frieza and Vegeta as more dominant, perhaps. Maybe. But Cell, I feel, embraced his destiny, and he was the most pompous, even more pompous than Frieza. When he gained his perfect form, he was just so sophisticated, and he loved toying with everybody. And one of the things I respected the most about Cell that's different than any other villain is that he starts out at a significant disadvantage, unlike the other villains. He's stronger than some people, sure, but there are several people that are certainly more powerful than he is. I mean, at some point, Vegeta, Piccolo, maybe Android 16, were all capable of destroying him at some point. And honestly, Cell would run, he would flee, he would hide to search the androids and achieve his destiny, because he was so dedicated. He actually came back from an alternate timeline and waited it out. He tried to ultimately go back in time and alter things so that he could gain his dream. He killed Trunks. So he was very conniving, very strategic. He planned things out, and he waited. And he used strategy. He snuck around. There was a point where if somebody was coming, he knew that if a couple of the Z fighters gathered together to destroy him, he knew he'd lose. He knew he would lose. He would die. And that's something that you can't say about any other villain, really, is that they started off in a position where they could be killed at the beginning of the arc, and they had to work up and gain their power. Cell had to work for his power, which I respect. So, and I also think he's technically the most intelligent of any of the combatant villains. But Cell is a fascinating villain, and I really do feel that his ending could have been an excellent ending to the series as well. He just had an enjoyable arc from the androids up to that final tournament. Maybe not perfect, but he's always been my personal favorite. On a side note, even though King Cold was barely there, he was pretty awesome too. Well, that was my list of my top 10 favorite Dragon Ball Z villains. So please let me know, guys, what are your top 5 or top 10 favorite Dragon Ball Z villains? Any villains you were surprised that I mentioned or didn't mention on this list? Yeah, just let me know. We'll start some conversations and see how it is. Alright, guys, Merlin out. Peace.